A K-9 officer came home to surprise his aging parents, but their house was silent, cold, and almost empty. The family photos were gone, the mailbox was full, and the chimney had no smoke. Then his German Shepherd found one thing in the snow: his mother's damp wool glove. That small clue led them into the woods, toward a hidden cabin and a truth no one wanted to say out loud. Because sometimes the people we think are safe are only quiet because they are afraid. Tell us where you're watching from, and please like, share, and subscribe. Brendan Cole Ashford had imagined the road home differently. In his mind, Pine Hollow would appear the way it always had when memory was kind to him. A small Montana town tucked beneath pale winter mountains, chimney smoke lifting from steep roofs, the late afternoon sun catching on snowbanks piled along Main Street. He imagined his mother standing on the porch before he even stepped out of the truck, one hand pressed to her chest, half laughing and half scolding him for not calling ahead. He imagined his father pretending not to care, leaning in the doorway with his old mechanic's shoulders squared, saying something dry like, "Took you long enough." Brendan had rehearsed that version for the last 80 miles. He had not called ahead. That was the point. After a long stretch of K-9 work in Spokane, missing person calls, drug searches, icy back roads, motel rooms that smelled of old coffee and disinfectant, he wanted one thing in his life to feel simple: a son coming home, a mother surprised, a father hiding tears behind a complaint about the weather. Beside him, Voss sat upright in the passenger seat, steady as a carved shadow. The German Shepherd was 8 now, though no one who saw him working would have guessed it at first glance. His black and tan coat was thick against the cold, the dark saddle across his back, catching blue light from the snow outside. His muzzle had deepened with age, but his amber-brown eyes remained sharp, watchful, disciplined. One ear bore a small old nick near the tip, a scar from a shattered window during a search years earlier. Brendan had once joked that Voss collected scars the way other dogs collected sticks. Voss had not found that funny. The dog's black harness lay folded in the back seat for once. Today, he wore only a sturdy collar, the silver tag at his throat tapping softly whenever the truck hit a rough patch in the road. Off-duty, or at least as close to off-duty as Voss ever allowed himself to be. "Almost there," Brendan said. Voss did not wag his tail. He simply shifted his gaze from the windshield to Brendan, then back to the road, as if acknowledging a fact rather than a promise. Brendan smiled faintly. He was 47, tall and athletic in the way that came less from gyms than from years of bad weather, long nights, and body armor. His dark navy police jacket hung over the back of his seat, but he wore a charcoal patrol coat now, jeans, black winter boots, and the square black wristwatch he touched whenever he needed to think before acting. Short dark hair, trimmed police neat, framed a face that looked calmer than it often felt. His blue-gray eyes had learned how to command a room, question a witness, and reassure a frightened child without changing much on the surface. They were not as good at reading his own family. That thought came and went before he could hold it. He had done what he could. That was what Brendan had told himself for years. Every month he sent money home through Trevor, his younger brother, who had stayed in Pine Hollow and handled the practical things: prescriptions, property taxes, repairs to the roof, a furnace part, a new set of tires for their mother's aging car. Trevor always had a reason, and the reasons had always sounded ordinary enough to be believed. Brendan worked. Brendan sent money. Brendan answered texts late. Brendan called on birthdays, or close enough to birthdays that apologies could smooth the edges. It had felt like responsibility. The last 10 miles narrowed through white fields and stands of pine. The road curled past the frozen creek where he and Trevor used to throw rocks through thin ice, then climbed toward the old Ashford place on the edge of town. Brendan slowed as the house came into view. At first, his mind refused the shape of what he saw. The house was still there, the porch, the sloped roof, the cottonwood at the far corner of the yard, bare and black against the snow. The shed with one door forever sagging on its hinge. It was all there, yet the place seemed wrong in a way he could not name quickly. Then he named it. No tracks in the drive. Not fresh ones. Not even the uneven marks his father's old boots would have made between house and mailbox. Snow had fallen, melted slightly, frozen again, then been dusted with a new skin of white. No shovel had cut a path to the porch. The mailbox leaned with its door half open, stuffed so full that envelopes had bent at the corners. No smoke rose from the chimney. Brendan eased the truck to a stop. Voss stood before the engine had fully settled. His body changed almost imperceptibly. Head lifting, ears forward, breath quieter. Not alarm, not yet. Assessment. Brendan opened his door and stepped into the cold. The air bit cleanly at his face. It smelled of snow, pine resin, and something old beneath it, something closed away. "Mom," he called. The word traveled across the yard and came back empty. He took the porch steps carefully. The first board groaned under his boot. His mother used to keep a wreath on the door every winter, even when Christmas had passed and the ribbon faded pink from sun. There was no wreath now, only a pale oval where one had once hung. Brendan knocked. Nothing. He knocked again, harder. "Dad?" "It's Brendan." Inside, silence held its breath. His first instinct was professional. Check points of entry, look for forced access, listen for movement, observe without contaminating more than necessary. But his second instinct was older, more frightened, and harder to manage. It said, "Open the door." It said, "They are inside." It said, "You should have called more." The front door was unlocked. That frightened him more than if it had been broken. Arthur Ashford had locked doors even during Sunday dinners. He had once locked the garage while Brendan was still in it, then laughed for 10 minutes after realizing his mistake. A locked door, Arthur used to say, was not about fear. It was about respect for what a home held. Brendan pushed the door open. Dust met him first. Not a thin layer from a weekend away, but a dull gray settling that softened edges and turned furniture into objects abandoned by memory. The entry table was still there, but the ceramic bowl where Marion kept keys was gone. A spiderweb trembled in the corner near the ceiling. Voss entered behind him, low and silent, claws clicking once against the old floorboards before he adjusted his steps. The living room had been stripped in small, deliberate ways. The blue armchair where Arthur watched weather reports was missing. Marion's reading basket was gone. The crooked floor lamp remained, but its shade had collapsed inward as if tired of standing. On the wall above the mantel were pale rectangles where family photographs used to hang. Brendan stood before them for longer than he meant to. There had been a picture of him in uniform there, another of Trevor holding a fish far too small for the grin on his face. His parents on their 35th anniversary, Marion wearing a lavender sweater, Arthur looking uncomfortable in a tie. The photographs were gone, but the wall remembered their shapes. That was worse somehow. Someone had not packed in a hurry. Someone had removed the faces. Voss moved through the room, nose low, not searching wildly but reading the house in layers. Brendan followed him into the kitchen. The kitchen had always been Marion's kingdom. Not fancy, never that, but warm, yellow curtains, a jar of wooden spoons. The smell of bread or soup or coffee too weak because Arthur complained when she made it strong. Now the counters were bare except for a chipped mug turned upside down near the sink. One cabinet door hung open, revealing a few mismatched plates and a box of tea bags dry with age. Brendan opened the refrigerator. The light flickered. Inside sat an old box of baking soda, a jar of mustard, and nothing else. He closed it quickly. For the first time since he was a boy, Brendan felt too large for that kitchen. Not physically. He had outgrown it decades ago, but morally. As if the room had been waiting to ask him where he had been, and he had no answer that would survive being spoken aloud. He touched the face of his black watch with his thumb. A habit. Control your breathing. Slow the body. Let the facts arrive before judgment. But facts were cruel in familiar rooms. On the windowsill, he saw a faint ring where Marion's violet pot had once sat. She had watered that plant every morning, even after it stopped blooming. On the pantry door remained a pencil mark showing Brendan's height at 13, then Trevor's at 10, both names written in Marion's careful hand. Brendan ran his fingers close to the marks without touching them. He remembered standing there impatiently, wanting the measuring done so he could run outside. He remembered his mother telling him one day he would wish time moved slower. He had laughed. In the hall, Voss gave a sharp breath. Brendan turned. The dog stood near the back door, body still, nose angled toward the mudroom. His ears were high. His tail did not move. Brendan crossed the kitchen slowly, hand dropping by reflex toward where his duty belt would have been if he were in uniform. "What is it?" Voss lowered his head. Beside the rear threshold, half tucked under the warped edge of a floor mat, lay a gray wool glove, small, damp, worn thin at the fingertips. Brendan crouched. He knew that glove. Marion had owned the pair for years. She always complained they were ugly, and always chose them over nicer ones because they fit her hands just right. He had seen her wear them while scraping frost from the kitchen window, while carrying firewood in small bundles, while waving goodbye from this very doorway. He picked it up. The wool was cold and wet, but not old wet, not moldy, not forgotten for months. Melted snow clung to the fibers. Beneath the smell of damp wool and winter earth was something faint and clean, lavender soap. His mother's soap. A strange weakness passed through Brendan's knees, so brief he might have denied it if Voss had not looked at him. "She was here," Brendan whispered. The words did not comfort him. They rearranged the fear. His mother had not simply vanished 2 years ago or last season, or into whatever story Trevor had been telling. She had come back recently, close enough that the glove still carried her. Close enough that the house had not finished swallowing the trace. Voss stepped forward and pressed his nose to the glove. He inhaled once, then lifted his head toward the back door. The old police part of Brendan understood immediately. The son in him resisted. "No," he said softly, though he did not know whom he was refusing. Voss looked back at him. No drama, no bark. Just a steady amber gaze Brendan had trusted in alleys, blizzards, dark buildings, and searches where hope had narrowed to a scent no human could follow. If Voss had the trail, then there was a trail. Brendan stood and pushed the glove carefully into his coat pocket. He opened the back door. Cold rushed in. The yard behind the house sloped toward a stand of pine and leafless brush. Beyond that, the land folded into old timber and logging paths, the kind of woods children believed they knew until they entered them as adults and realized memory did not draw reliable maps. "Find her," Brendan said. Voss moved. Not fast at first. He dropped his nose to the packed snow near the steps, worked the line where the glove must have fallen, then angled left toward a gap in the brush. Brendan followed. Locking the door behind him out of instinct, though, there was almost nothing left inside to protect. The trail was difficult, but not dead. A partial footprint near the woodpile, a drag mark where someone had slipped, a broken twig hanging wet and raw from a low branch. Voss stitched these fragments together with the invisible certainty of training and trust. Brendan called once. "Mom!" The woods answered with the creak of frozen branches. He called again louder. "Dad!" No answer. They moved deeper into the trees. Snow lay unevenly underfoot, crusted in places, soft in others. Brendan's boots broke through old layers with dull crunches. His breath smoked before him. Twice, Voss paused where wind had scattered the scent, circling with patient discipline until he caught it again. Brendan let him work. That was another thing he understood too well. Sometimes the only way to find what mattered was to stop rushing the one creature still calm enough to know where to go. As they walked, memories rose without permission. His father showing him how to change a tire in this same cold, refusing to let him quit when his hands hurt. His mother standing at the back door with a towel over one shoulder, calling both boys in before dark. Trevor racing ahead on a sled, fearless, until he hit a stump and cried into Marion's coat. Brendan had not thought of that in years. Trevor. The name landed uneasily. His younger brother had always been the one nearby, the one who stayed after graduation, the one who knew which Dr. Arthur liked, which grocery store Marion preferred, which neighbor plowed driveways for cash. Brendan had been the distant one with a badge, a dog, and a bank transfer scheduled for the 1st of every month. He had called that trust. Now, with every step into the trees, it began to feel like negligence dressed in respectable clothing. Voss stopped. Brendan froze behind him. Ahead, through the pines, something gray lifted into the winter air. Smoke, thin, almost shy. A single thread rising from a place the trees tried to hide. Brendan moved forward more slowly now. His hand rested near Voss's collar, not to restrain him, but to feel the dog's steadiness through his fingers. The cabin appeared piece by piece, a low roof patched with tin, a crooked stovepipe, a porch half buried in snow, firewood stacked beneath a tarp. It was too small for anyone to live in through a Montana winter, too hidden to be accidental. Voss climbed the 2 porch steps and stopped before the door. He did not bark, he did not scratch. He simply stood in front of Brendan, body angled slightly across him, not like a dog preparing to attack, but like one placing himself between fear and whatever might come next. Brendan stared at the closed door. Behind it was heat. Smoke. Possibly his parents. Possibly the answer to every question he had not known he should have been asking. He lifted his hand to knock, and for the first time in many years, Officer Brendan Cole Ashford felt less like a man trained to enter danger than a son terrified of what his own absence had allowed to happen. His knuckles touched the wood. The sound was small. In the snowy silence, it felt like a confession. For several seconds after Brendan knocked, nothing moved inside the cabin. The wind passed through the pines behind him, pushing loose snow from the branches in soft white falls. Somewhere deep in the trees, a limb cracked under ice. Voss stood motionless on the porch, his body angled across Brendan's knees, not blocking him exactly, but making sure whatever came through the door would meet the dog first. Brendan knocked again. "Mom?" His voice sounded smaller than he expected. "Dad, it's me." A sound came from inside, not footsteps at first, a scrape, a chair leg against wood, then silence again, as if the person behind the door had frozen halfway between hiding and answering. Brendan lowered his hand to Voss's collar. "It's Brendan," he said more gently. "I'm alone." That was not entirely true. Voss was there, and Voss had never been merely a dog to anyone who had watched him work. But Brendan knew his mother. If fear had put her on the other side of that door, the word alone might matter more than any explanation. The latch shifted. The door opened only as wide as a hand. Marion Ashford looked through the gap. For one terrible heartbeat, Brendan did not recognize her as his mother. He recognized the outline first, the small frame, the pale hair, the careful way she held her shoulders as though neatness could substitute for warmth. Then he saw her eyes, blue and tired, moving past him toward the trees before they found his face. She had always been slight. Age had not made her smaller so much as it had taken away the soft defenses of health. Her cheekbones showed too clearly. Her silver blonde hair had come loose from a low knot, wisps clinging to her temples. One hand clutched the edge of the door. The other was wrapped in a gray wool glove, the right glove. Brendan felt the left one heavy in his coat pocket. "Mom," he whispered. Marion's mouth opened. Nothing came out at first. Her eyes filled, but the fear did not leave them. Only after she looked into the trees a second time did she open the door wider. "Brendan." The sound of his name broke on the second syllable. She stepped forward, and he caught her as she folded against him. He had imagined her embrace 100 times while driving home. He had imagined warmth, surprise, the smell of coffee on her sweater. This was different. She felt light enough to frighten him. Her coat was thin, her shoulder blades pressed against his arms. Beneath the faint lavender scent was smoke, cold wool, and hunger carefully hidden. "I came home," he said. It was the only sentence he had. It was not enough. Voss remained still beside them. Marion looked down at him through tears. "Voss," she said, with the fragile wonder of someone seeing a good thing arrive in a bad place. "You brought him." Brendan could not tell whether she meant the dog had brought him to the cabin, or whether the dog had brought him home from whatever life had kept him away. Inside, the cabin was warmer than the woods, but not warm enough. Heat came from a small iron stove in the corner, its fire burning low, the kind of fire made by people counting every piece of wood before using it. The room smelled of smoke, canned broth, damp socks, and medicine. Arthur Ashford sat at a small table near the stove. Brendan stopped just inside the doorway. His father had once filled doorways. He had been broad without trying, hands blackened from engines, voice firm enough to settle arguments before they began. Now he sat wrapped in a brown sweater with elbows worn shiny, a flannel shirt buttoned wrong at the throat, and a blanket over his knees. His white hair lay thin against his head. His big hands, still the hands of a mechanic, curled around a chipped enamel cup with a blue rim. Arthur did not stand. That frightened Brendan almost as much as the empty house had. "Dad," he said. Arthur looked up slowly. His gray-brown eyes held shame before they held joy. "Son, one word, dry, hoarse." Heavy as a door being opened after years of pressure against it. The cabin had 2 rooms if Mercy was generous. The front room held the stove, the table, 2 mismatched chairs, a narrow cot made up with layered blankets, a shelf of cans, and a lantern with extra batteries stacked beside it. Behind a hanging curtain, Brendan could see boxes packed tightly, labeled in Marion's handwriting. Linens, winter, documents, photos, not many boxes. Too few for a life. A Bible with a cracked brown cover sat near the medicine bottles. A strip of masking tape on the inside cover bore the name of First Community Church. Brendan noticed details because noticing was easier than feeling. Blood pressure medication, heart medication, 2 pill organizers, one nearly empty, a flashlight with a cracked lens, 4 cans of soup, a loaf of bread with the twist tie folded carefully around the plastic, firewood stacked near the stove, most of it damp at the bark. Clean, though. The floor had been swept, the cups had been washed, a towel hung straight from a nail by the basin. Poverty had entered the room, but Marion had made it wipe its. That almost undid him. "Sit," Marion said quickly, as if hospitality could outrun disaster. "You must be frozen." Brendan did not move. "What happened to the house?" Marion turned toward the stove, though nothing needed tending. Arthur looked down into his cup. The silence had a practiced shape. Brendan knew that shape. He had heard it in living rooms where bruised spouses said they had fallen, in motel offices where runaway kids insisted they were just traveling, in kitchens where elderly men laughed off missing checks because family problems were not police business. He had never expected to hear it from his own parents. Arthur cleared his throat. "Paper trouble." Brendan stared at him. "Paper trouble," he repeated. Arthur's thumb rubbed the chipped edge of the cup, back and forth, back and forth. "It got complicated," Arthur said. The words were so small they made the room feel colder. Brendan took 1 step forward. "I sent money every month." Marion flinched, not because he had shouted, he had not, but because the sentence had entered the cabin like something sharp. "I know," she said. "No." Brendan fought to keep his voice level. "I don't think I understand what you know." Voss moved into the room then, slow and deliberate. He sniffed once near the stove, once near Arthur's boots, then lowered himself beside the door with his chest toward the outside. His ears stayed alert, but his body settled. A guard, not a threat. Marion watched him, and something in her face softened. "He always did know where to stand," she murmured. Brendan wanted to ask who she meant, the dog or him or the son he had failed to be. He did not trust himself enough to find out. Arthur's voice came low. "Trevor said you were busy." The name changed the air. Brendan looked at his father. "Trevor said a lot of things." Marion's hand went to the edge of the table. She gripped it as if the wood might move under her. "Please," she said, "don't call him. Not tonight." Brendan turned toward her. There it was, not confusion, not surprise, fear with a name attached to it. "Mom, not tonight," she repeated. Her voice was quiet, but desperation lived inside it. "You just got here." That sentence hurt more than any accusation could have. You just got here. As if his arrival were a fragile thing, already in danger of being broken by the truth. Brendan could feel heat rising in him. The officer in him wanted structure. Questions, timeline. Who signed what? Who knew where they were? Why was his mother afraid of Trevor? Why had his father let the word paper stand where the word harm belonged? The son in him wanted to drive back into town, find his brother, and put every unanswered year between them on the table like evidence. He did neither. He looked at Arthur's swollen hands. Marion's thin wrists, the stove struggling with wet wood, the cans lined up like rationed hope. If he pushed too hard, they would retreat. He had seen it happen to strangers. Victims defended the people who hurt them. Parents defended children who had stolen from them. Old people protected pride long after pride had stopped protecting them. Brendan swallowed the question he wanted to ask. "All right," he said. Marion closed her eyes. Arthur's thumb stopped moving on the cup. "I won't call him tonight," Brendan said, "but I'm staying." Marion opened her eyes again. "There isn't room. I've slept in worse places." Arthur gave a faint huff. It might once have become a laugh. "That's supposed to comfort your mother?" "No," Brendan said. "It's supposed to tell her arguing won't help." For the first time, something like memory crossed Arthur's face. The old father. The man who had once respected stubbornness when it came from the right place. Marion turned back to the stove and began making soup, because doing something with her hands seemed to be the only way she could keep from breaking. She opened a can of broth, added water, then sliced one potato so thin Brendan could see the knife through some pieces. He took off his coat and reached for the knife. "I can do that. I have cut potatoes since before you had teeth." "Mom," she paused. It was not the word that stopped her. It was the way he said it, not as a boy asking for food, not as an officer managing a scene, but as a man asking to be allowed one small act of repair. After a moment, she handed him the knife. They ate at the small table with Voss by the door. Marion gave Brendan the largest portion. He noticed. She noticed him noticing and dared him with her eyes to refuse, so he ate. The soup tasted thin, smoky, and too salty. It was the best and worst thing he had eaten in months. Arthur said little. Marion asked questions that touched only the surface. The drive, Spokane weather, whether Voss still hated the vacuum cleaner. Brendan answered because he understood what she was doing. She was building a fence around the evening, trying to keep wolves named Money, House, Trevor, and Shame from coming too close to the table. But every ordinary question revealed what was not being said. "How long have you been here?" Brendan asked at last. Marion's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. Arthur looked at the stove. "On and off," his father said. "That isn't an answer. It's the one I have tonight." Brendan looked down at his own hands. He could have pushed. He could have turned the room into an interview. Instead, he pressed his thumb against the scratched face of his watch and breathed until the first answer he wanted to give became the second one he chose. "Okay." Marion's eyes filled again, but she did not cry. Perhaps tears had become something she spent carefully now. Later, Brendan carried in more wood from the lean-to. Most of it was damp, but he found enough dry pieces beneath the tarp to strengthen the fire. Arthur tried to rise and help, then sank back with a grimace he attempted to hide. Brendan saw it. Arthur saw Brendan see it. Neither man spoke. Some silences were mercy, others were cowardice. Brendan was no longer sure which kind filled the room. Night gathered early in the trees. The cabin seemed smaller after dark. The lantern gave the walls a yellow tremble. Snow tapped lightly against the window. Marion washed the bowls in a basin, using less water than any person should have to use for ordinary dignity. Arthur sat with his chipped cup, holding it more than drinking from it. Brendan spread his coat near the door and sat with his back against the wall. Voss lay across the threshold, half facing the room and half facing the woods. "Your dog always sleep like that?" Arthur asked. "When he thinks someone needs guarding." Arthur looked toward the window. Smart dog. He learned from watching people make bad decisions. Arthur's mouth twitched. Then it faded. Marion blew out the lantern after a while, leaving only the stove glow. Brendan did not sleep. He listened to the cabin breathe. His mother's quiet cough behind the curtain. His father shifting in pain and pretending it was the blanket. Voss's steady inhale and exhale near the door. Around midnight, Voss lifted his head. No growl, no bark, just sudden stillness. Brendan opened his eyes. Voss was already standing. Brendan rose without sound and moved to the window. He separated the curtain with 2 fingers. At first, there was only the dark between trees. Then he saw it. Headlights. Dimmed by distance and branches, they rolled slowly along the old logging road beyond the cabin. Not close enough to be a visitor, not far enough to be coincidence. The vehicle stopped. The lights remained on for several seconds, shining pale across the trunks. Then they went out, the engine cut. The absence of sound was worse than the arrival. Behind Brendan, a floorboard gave the softest creak. He turned. Marion stood in the doorway of the sleeping corner, one hand at her throat, her face pale in the stove glow. She did not ask what he had seen. That was how Brendan knew she already understood. Arthur was awake too. He had not moved from the cot, but his hand had closed around the chipped cup so tightly Brendan could see the tendons in his wrist. Voss stood at the door, ears forward, body low but controlled. Brendan reached for his phone. His thumb hovered over the screen. Call it in. That was the clean answer. A vehicle watching an isolated cabin at midnight. Elderly parents in unsafe conditions. A possible intimidation pattern. He had called for less in other people's lives, but this was not his jurisdiction. These were his parents. Any report made in panic, without their cooperation, might send Marion into silence and Arthur into shame. If deputies arrived with lights cutting through the trees, whoever sat on that road would be gone long before they came. And Brendan would have turned his first night back into a scene his parents might never forgive him for bringing to their door. His duty warred with his blood. He lowered the phone. Not because he intended to ignore it, because tomorrow had to be done properly. The headlights flicked on again. The vehicle turned slowly, tires crunching over frozen ruts, and disappeared back through the trees. Only when the last trace of light vanished did Marion breathe. Go lie down, Brendan said gently. She looked at him for a long time. You always did sound like your father when you were trying not to be scared. Arthur made a rough sound from the cot. Nobody asked you to tell him that. Marion almost smiled. Almost. That almost smile hurt Brendan more than her tears. He returned to his place by the door. Voss did not lie down right away. The German shepherd remained standing, gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the wood, as though committing the night to memory. Brendan sat beside him and rested one hand on the dog's shoulder. In the morning, he would go into town. Not to drag Trevor out by the collar. Not to flash a badge in rooms where he had no right to use it. Not to make his parents into evidence before they were ready to speak. He would start with the sheriff. Then someone who knew elder protection. Then records. Then the money. He looked at his mother's glove lying on the small table where he had placed it, the left one beside the right, reunited but still damp from the snow. For years, Brendan had believed his family was safe because he kept sending help from a distance. Now he understood distance had been the place where lies learned to grow. Outside, the forest settled back into silence. Inside, Voss stayed awake until dawn. Morning came without warmth. The sky above Pine Hollow was pale and clean, the kind of winter blue that made every shadow look sharper. Brendan left the cabin after making sure the stove had enough dry wood to last through midday, and after Marion promised, twice, that she would not try to walk back to the old house alone. She made the promise with her eyes on the floor. Arthur said nothing. He sat beside the stove with the chipped enamel cup in both hands, watching Brendan put on his coat as if watching a man leave for a war no one had declared. Voss stood at the door, ready before Brendan touched the handle. Marion reached down and brushed her fingers over the German shepherd's head. Voss lowered himself slightly, allowing the touch. It was not a trick, not training. Brendan had seen him do it with frightened children, injured hikers, old men whose pride made them refuse help, until the dog leaned close enough to make refusal feel cruel. Bring him back careful, Marion said. For 1 second, Brendan thought she meant Voss. Then he understood she meant himself. He nodded, because if he tried to answer, he might ask again what she was afraid of. And if he asked, she might close the door in the only way she still could. The drive into town took longer than it should have. Snow had hardened along the ruts of the logging road, forcing Brendan to steer slowly until the truck reached pavement. Pine Hollow opened below him in small pieces, white roofs, dark chimneys, a church steeple leaned slightly by weather, The low brick line of Main Street facing the mountains, as if the town had been built to endure being watched by them. He had grown up believing small towns knew everything. That morning, he began to understand they sometimes knew only what they had been told often enough. The sheriff's office sat beside the courthouse, a squat tan building with a flag snapping in the cold and a row of county trucks crusted with salt. Brendan parked near the side entrance. He left Voss in the truck with the window cracked and the heat still lingering, not because Voss could not come in, but because Brendan needed the first conversation to belong to the law, not to grief. Sheriff Calvin Briggs looked up from behind his desk when Brendan entered. Calvin had aged into the shape of his office. He was 59, broad through the chest, with a weathered face, a silver mustache that gave him the look of a man who had once been stricter than he was now, and pale eyes that missed very little. His tan sheriff's uniform fit neatly, but not freshly. The badge on his chest had fine scratches around the edges from years of winter coats, seatbelts, and leaning across counters to listen to people lie badly. For a moment, he did not speak. Then he set down his pen. "Brendan Ashford," he said, "your mother told people you were too busy to come home." It was not accusation in his voice. That made it worse. Brendan took off his gloves. "I need to report a welfare concern." Calvin's eyes changed. "Not much. Your parents?" Brendan nodded. He told the story without dressing it in emotion. The empty house, the glove, the cabin, the missing furniture, the medication, the vehicle on the logging road, Marion's fear, Arthur's paper trouble, Trevor's name sitting in the middle of the room like a stove no one dared touch. Calvin listened without interrupting. Halfway through, he rose, closed the office door, and returned to his chair. When Brendan finished, Calvin leaned back and rubbed 2 fingers over his mustache. "You carrying your Spokane credentials?" "Yes." "Don't use them here." The sentence landed hard. Brendan's jaw tightened. "I wasn't planning to pull rank. I'm not talking about rank." Calvin's voice remained even. "I'm talking about habit. You know how to walk into a room and make people answer. You know how to read a system, push a clerk, press a witness, ask a question 3 different ways until somebody gives you the piece that doesn't fit." Brendan said nothing. "That works when the victim isn't your mother," Calvin said. "It works when the suspect isn't your brother." The word suspect hit the office like a dropped tool. Brendan looked toward the window, where his truck sat in the blue morning light, and Voss's ears were visible above the seat. Calvin softened by 1/2 inch. "I'm not telling you to stand down because I don't care. I'm telling you because if this becomes a case, every step matters. If you start pulling records, questioning people, or leaning on anyone with a badge in your pocket, Trevor's lawyer, if it gets that far, we'll use it to poison the whole thing." Brendan hated that he was right. He touched the face of his watch with his thumb. "So what do I do?" "You do what sons are allowed to do," Calvin said. "You protect them. You document what you personally saw. You give statements. You help them trust the people who can step in, and you let my office and Adult Protective Services open the official door." For a man used to entering first, it felt like being told to wait outside his own burning house. Calvin picked up the phone. "There's someone you need to meet." Iris Caldwell arrived 20 minutes later, with a red folder under one arm and snow still melting on the shoulders of her burgundy quilted coat. She was in her early 50s, black, medium height, with short curls threaded with silver and brown-framed glasses that made her look less gentle than precise. When Calvin introduced her as Adult Protective Services, she did not offer Brendan a pitying smile. She offered him a chair. That was when he began to trust her. "Your parents are not evidence," Iris said after hearing the basics. "They are people who may have spent a long time surviving by refusing to call survival a problem." Brendan sat stiffly across from her. "They're living in a church cabin with barely enough food. I believe you. My father has heart medication sitting next to a stove like camping supplies. I believe that too. Then why does this sound like we're moving slowly?" Iris folded her hands over the red folder. Her voice was low, steady, and practiced in rooms where families often arrived already angry. Because if I walk into that cabin with a sheriff and forms and say, "Tell me which child harmed you," your mother may deny everything. Your father may say he signed what he signed freely. They may decide you brought the government to punish their son and take away their choices. Brendan stared at her. Older adults hide exploitation for many reasons, Iris continued. Shame, fear, loyalty, confusion. A belief that family pain should stay private. Sometimes they believe if they admit what happened, the solution will be worse than the abuse. He thought of Marion's hand gripping the table, Arthur's thumb rubbing the chipped cup, the way neither of them had used Trevor's name unless Brendan forced the room toward it. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Trust," Iris said. "Not theirs in me, yours in the process, then theirs through you." The answer was not satisfying. It was probably true. Outside the sheriff's office, Voss rose in the truck as Brendan approached. The dog's gaze moved from Brendan's face to Iris, then back. Brendan opened the passenger door, and Voss stepped down into the snow with contained power. Iris did not reach for him. "Working dog?" she asked. "Always, whether I ask him to or not." "Good." She looked at Voss, not as a novelty, but as a professional might look at another professional. "Then he may be the calmest person in that cabin when I come by." Voss blinked once, accepting the compliment without gratitude. By late morning, Brendan found himself in the one diner Pine Hollow had never managed to lose. The old sign still read Ellie's, though Ellie had been gone for 15 years, and no one remembered whether her pancakes had actually been better than anyone else's. The windows fogged from heat and coffee. Men in insulated jackets sat along the counter. A teenage waitress moved between tables with a pot in one hand and the tired grace of someone who knew everybody's usual order and half their family troubles. Conversation thinned when Brendan entered. It did not stop. Pine Hollow people were too polite for that. They simply lowered their voices, glanced once, then pretended not to be looking. Brendan took a booth in the back. Voss lay beneath the table, close to his left boot, visible enough that no one mistook him for a pet. He had barely opened the menu when a woman in a dark green coat stopped beside the booth. "Brendan?" He looked up. Eleanor Pike had lived 2 houses down from the Ashfords when Brendan was a boy. She had been tall then, with black hair and a voice that could cut across 3 yards when calling children in from trouble. Now her hair was white and pulled into a careful bun, her back slightly bent, but her eyes were the same, sharp, blue, and unwilling to waste time pretending. "Mrs. Pike," Brendan said, standing halfway. She waved him down and slid into the seat across from him without asking. For a moment she looked at his face the way older neighbors do, measuring the child they remembered against the stranger who had returned wearing the child's bones. "I saw your truck at the office," she said. Brendan waited. Eleanor glanced toward the counter, then lowered her voice. "You found them?" The question closed around his chest. "Yes." Her mouth, "Thank God. You knew they were out there?" Pain crossed her face, but not surprise. Most of us knew they were staying at the church cabin. We didn't know how bad it had gotten. "How long?" She looked down at her hands. Brendan already disliked the answer. Nearly 2 years. The diner noise dulled around him. 2 years contained holidays, winter storms, summer heat, Father's Day, Mother's Day, birthdays he had missed but paid for in money transfers. 2 years contained every chance he had not taken to ask one more question. "Why didn't anyone call me?" Eleanor flinched, but she did not look away. "We thought you knew." Brendan felt something in him go still. Eleanor went on, softer now. "Trevor said the house needed repairs. Then he said your folks wanted quiet. Said the cabin was temporary. Said you were helping with everything from Spokane." "I was helping. I know." Her eyes shone. That's what made it believable. The words did not accuse him. They simply found the crack already there and touched it. Brendan looked out the window. Across the street, a man shoveled snow from the hardware store entrance. Life continued with insulting calm. Eleanor reached into her coat pocket and placed a small envelope on the table. It was old, bent at one corner, addressed to Marion in a hand Brendan recognized from church bake sale labels. "I wrote this last Christmas," Eleanor said. Just a card. I brought it by the house, but Trevor was there. He said your mother was resting and he'd take it to her. Brendan stared at the envelope. I found it 3 weeks later in the trash bin behind the garage, she said. Still sealed. He did not touch it. The envelope sat between them, a small white proof of how a family could be isolated without bars on the windows. I should have done more, Eleanor said. Brendan shook his head slowly. So should I. That was the first time he said it aloud, not fully, not enough, but enough for the room inside him to hear. After the diner, Calvin sent him to speak with Naomi Fletcher. Naomi no longer worked at the bank, but everyone in town still called her the bank lady. The way small towns kept professions attached to people long after retirement. She met Brendan in a corner of the public library, where sunlight fell across shelves of large print mysteries and the heating system clicked with old building patience. She was 58, with short gray blonde hair, a navy cardigan, and reading glasses hanging from a chain. She had the composed caution of someone who had spent 30 years knowing exactly what could and could not be said. I cannot discuss anyone's account, she said before Brendan sat down. I understand. Good, because grief does not override privacy law. It was so plainly said that Brendan almost smiled. Naomi opened a small leather notebook, but I can explain patterns in general terms. She drew 3 circles on a blank page. Access, she said, labeling the first. Need, she labeled the second. Excuse. The third. Brendan watched the pen. A trusted child gets access to help with bills. That may be legitimate. Then that child develops a need, business trouble, debt, addiction, medical costs, pride. The excuse comes next. I'll pay it back. They would want to help me. It is easier if I handle it. No one else needs to worry. Brendan heard Trevor's voice through years of messages. Mom's prescription changed again. Dad's roof leak got worse. Taxes hit harder this year. I'll handle it, Bren. Just send what you can. Naomi looked at him over her glasses. The most dangerous theft in families often sounds like care while it's happening. He closed his eyes briefly. When his phone rang, he thought at first it might be Marion. It was Calvin. Brendan answered before the second ring. I've got something from county records, the sheriff said. His voice had lost its earlier patience. Not a conclusion, a starting point. Brendan stood. Naomi watched him carefully. The Ashford house was refinanced 3 years ago, Calvin said, then transferred into a management structure through a company called North Basin Holdings. On paper, it's not Trevor, not directly, but one of the mailing addresses connects to an equipment business he used to run. And the timing lines up close to your father's surgery. Brendan looked toward the library window. Outside, children in bright coats were throwing snow at each other near the steps, shrieking with careless joy. His hand tightened around the phone. Calvin continued, listen to me. This is a sign, not proof. We need documents. We need statements. We need capacity review. We need a lawyer who knows elder financial abuse. Brendan did not trust his voice right away. On the floor beside him, Voss rose without command. The dog had not heard Calvin's words. He did not need to. He read Brendan's body the way snow recorded footsteps. Finally, Brendan said, give me the lawyer's name. Calvin exhaled. That's the right answer. It did not feel right. It felt too slow. It felt like standing outside his parents' old house again, staring at pale rectangles where family photographs used to be. Understanding that the faces had been removed long before he noticed the wall was empty. Brendan ended the call and slipped the phone into his coat pocket. Naomi closed her notebook. I'm sorry, she said. He nodded once. Then he looked down at Voss, whose amber eyes waited without judgment. Without comfort so cheap it would insult the moment. Come on, Brendan said quietly. We do this clean. And for the first time since finding the glove, those words cost him more than anger would have. By the time Brendan returned to the cabin with Iris Caldwell, the morning brightness had begun to harden into afternoon glare. Snow flashed beneath the sun in broken fields between the pines. Every branch seemed edged with glass. The woods looked cleaner than anything human had done inside them, and that bothered Brendan more than he expected. The world had no trouble looking beautiful while people hid in it. Iris followed his truck in a county vehicle that had seen too many winters. No lights, no uniformed deputies, no performance of authority. That had been her first condition. "Your mother needs to see me walk in like help," Iris had said before they left town, not like consequence. Brendan had not liked how true that sounded. Voss stepped out first when they reached the clearing. He paused beside the truck, nose lifting once toward the trees, then toward the cabin. His black and tan coat caught a thin wash of sunlight. The nick in his left ear looked darker against the snow. No vehicle waited on the logging road now, no headlights, no witness except the pines. Still, Voss did not relax. Marian opened the door before Brendan knocked. For 1 second, relief crossed her face at the sight of him. Then she saw Iris behind him, the red folder under one arm, and the relief vanished. "No," Marian said. It was not loud. It was worse than loud. "Mom," Brendan began. "No." Her hand tightened around the doorframe. She wore the same cream cardigan from the night before, with a shawl pulled over her shoulders. Her silver blonde hair was pinned more neatly now, as if she had prepared for dignity, even while living in a room too small to protect it. "You said you wouldn't call Trevor. You didn't say you'd bring strangers. I didn't call Trevor. That is not the same as keeping peace." Iris did not move forward. She stood in the snow a few steps behind Brendan, calm in her burgundy coat, brown-framed glasses catching the pale light. She carried herself like a woman who knew how quickly a frightened person could turn a doorway into a wall. "Mrs. Ashford," Iris said gently, "my name is Iris Caldwell. I'm not here to take anyone anywhere today." Marian's eyes sharpened. People always say today when they mean eventually. Brendan felt the words hit him. There was more history in them than he knew what to do with. From inside, Arthur called, "Marian." His voice was thin but firm enough to stop her from closing the door. Voss moved then, not toward Iris, not toward the cabin. He stepped between everyone and lowered himself onto the porch boards, chest down, head resting on his paws, his amber eyes lifted to Marian with steady patience. The gesture changed the air. Not completely. Fear still stood in the doorway, but it had to step around the dog now, and somehow that made it smaller. Marian looked at Voss for a long moment. "You brought him to argue for you," she said to Brendan. "No," Brendan answered.
"He's better at not arguing than I am."
Arthur gave one dry cough from inside. It might have been amusement. Marian hesitated, then stepped back. The cabin looked smaller in daylight. Night had hidden some of the details kindness would have covered. The window had been sealed at the edges with strips of old cloth. A towel had been tucked beneath the door to stop the draft. The stove held a low fire, carefully fed. On the shelf, cans stood in a row with their labels facing out, an arrangement so tidy it felt like apology. Iris did not start with questions. She took off her gloves, asked where she could place her folder, and thanked Marian when Marian pointed to the table with visible reluctance. Then Iris looked around the room the way Brendan had been trained to look at a scene, but without making the people inside it feel like part of the damage. "How long does the stove hold heat at night?" Iris asked. Arthur frowned. "Long enough." Iris nodded as if that were a real answer. "And on the colder nights?" He looked away. Marian moved to the shelf. "We manage." "I can see that," Iris said. "Managing takes work." That stopped Marian more effectively than pity would have. Brendan remained near the door with Voss. He understood now that his presence could help or harm depending on how much space he took, so he took as little as possible. Iris asked permission before opening the pill organizers. She counted without comment. Heart medication, blood pressure tablets. A bottle with only 3 capsules left, another with a refill label dated 6 weeks ago. Marian hovered, one hand pressed into the edge of her shawl. "We were going to pick those up," she said. "When?" Iris asked. Marian's mouth tightened. Arthur answered for her. "When I could get to the house." Brendan looked at him. "The house?" Iris asked softly. Arthur's big hands closed over his knees. "Some things are still there." Marian turned sharply. "Arthur, I'm tired," he said. 2 words, quiet. Not surrender exactly, but the beginning of it. Iris did not leap on the opening. She wrote 1 note in the red folder and continued the assessment. Food supply. Heat. water, access to transportation, winter clothing, emergency contact numbers, whether either of them had fallen recently, whether either had felt pressured to sign documents they did not fully understand. At that question, Marion's face went rigid. "No one pressured us," she said. Arthur closed his eyes. Iris closed the folder halfway. "Mrs. Ashford, a person can be pressured by someone they love without that person raising a hand." Marion's lips trembled once. "You people put ugly words on everything. Sometimes ugly words are how we stop ugly things from hiding behind pretty ones." The room went still. Brendan looked down at Voss. The dog had lifted his head but did not rise. He watched Marion, not Iris, as if the choice in the room belonged to her. Marion sat slowly, not because she agreed, because standing had become too much. When Brendan brought her a glass of water from the small jug near the stove, her hand shook taking it. A folded paper slipped from the pocket of her cardigan and landed on the floor. Brendan bent to pick it up. "Don't," Marion said, but he already had. It was not a letter. It was a small page torn from a notepad, folded many times until the creases had softened. On one side were numbers written in Marion's careful hand. Dates, amounts. Brendan recognized them before his mind wanted to. His transfers, not all of them. 5 months. Maybe 6. Next to some amounts, Marion had written question marks. Beside one, she had written, Trevor said taxes. Medicine? Beside a larger one, emergency roof, no receipt. Under the page were 2 pharmacy receipts, both for partial fills. Brendan felt the cabin tilt around him. Marion reached for the paper, but he did not hand it back right away. "You knew I was sending money." Her eyes filled with tears she seemed furious to have. "I knew you sent some." "Some?" Trevor said. "Fees came out, debts attached to the house, penalties. Things I didn't understand." Brendan looked at Arthur. His father opened his eyes. "I knew enough," Arthur said. Marion turned toward him. "What?" Arthur stared at the stove as if the fire had written the truth there. "Not everything, not at first." "Arthur, I knew enough to know some wasn't coming through." Marion's face changed in a way Brendan had never seen. Not anger, not grief. Betrayal arriving from a direction she had not guarded. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. Arthur's hands trembled and he pressed them flat against his knees to stop it. "Because I let it start." No one spoke. Outside, snow slid from the roof and struck the ground with a soft, heavy sigh. Arthur swallowed. Trevor didn't walk in one day and steal the house. That would be easier to hate. Brendan's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. "He was there when I came home from surgery," Arthur said. "You remember that?" "No, you don't. You were working." "That isn't blame. It's fact." The sentence went through Brendan cleanly. "Trevor drove me to appointments. He fixed the back step before your mother broke her neck on it. He changed the pipe under the sink. He sat with me when the pills made the room spin and I couldn't remember if I'd paid the electric bill." Marion covered her mouth. Arthur's voice grew rougher. "Then his first company failed. He said he needed help for a few weeks. Payroll, he said. Men with families, trucks he couldn't lose. I told myself a father helps." Iris sat still, pen unmoving. "The second time, he said he was close to catching up. The third time, he said if he didn't move money around, creditors would come after everything. He used words I didn't know and sounded like he did." Arthur's eyes shifted to Brendan. "I signed because he was my son, and because I was tired, and because I wanted the conversation over." The shame in his face was so naked Brendan had to look away. Arthur had taught him how to stand straight, how to shake hands, how to change oil, how to finish what he started. Now the old man sat in a borrowed cabin explaining how he had bent himself into silence one signature at a time. "I thought I was protecting your mother from worry," Arthur said. "Then I thought I was protecting Trevor from ruin. Then I thought I was protecting myself from admitting what a fool I'd been." Marion began to cry quietly, not dramatically, not with the abandon of someone seeking comfort. Tears simply left her, as if they had waited too long and no longer needed permission. Brendan looked at the folded paper in his hand. Those numbers were not just money. They were months when he had believed responsibility could be automated. He laid the paper on the table gently. Iris spoke after a long moment. "Mr. Ashford, do you still have copies of anything you signed? Arthur gave a tired laugh with no humor in it. If I did, I probably put them somewhere safe and then forgot what safe meant. Marion wiped her face with both hands. There are boxes behind the curtain, some things, not enough. Enough to start, Iris said. They did not get much further before the sound came from outside. Not an engine this time. A soft scrape through snow, a dull bump, then another. Voss stood. Brendan turned toward the door, one hand already reaching for the place where a duty belt would have sat. He stopped himself. The movement had been pure habit. The door opened before he could reach it. A young woman stood on the porch with both hands wrapped around the handle of a small red sled loaded with supplies. Bread, cough medicine, a bundle of split wood tied with twine, a plastic bag from the pharmacy, a pair of thick socks. Her breath came fast from the climb through the trees. She froze when she saw Brendan. For a second the years collapsed badly. The last time Brendan had seen Mara Ashford in person, she had been a skinny child with missing teeth and glitter on her shoes, hiding behind Trevor's leg at a summer barbecue. Now she was 19, maybe younger in the face and older in the eyes. Her light brown hair was tucked under a navy knit cap, with loose strands sticking to her cheeks. A denim jacket lined with worn sherpa hung open over a hoodie, and her black jeans were wet to the knee from the trail. The sled rope slipped from her gloved hand. "Uncle Brendan," she said. Marion rose too quickly. "Mara, honey." Arthur looked as if he had been caught committing a crime by someone he loved. Mara's eyes moved from Brendan to Iris, then to Voss, then to the red folder on the table. Her face closed. "I should go." "No," Brendan said. The word came out too sharp. Mara flinched. He forced himself softer. "Please, don't." Voss stepped around Brendan and approached the porch. Mara stood perfectly still as the German shepherd sniffed the snow near her boots, then the sled, then her gloved hands. His posture remained calm. After a moment, he turned and walked back inside, as if declaring she belonged. Mara made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. "I brought cough medicine," she said to Marion, because that was easier than explaining herself. "And the crackers Grandpa says taste like cardboard," Arthur muttered. "They do." Marion wiped her face quickly and went to the door. "You shouldn't have come in daylight." The sentence revealed too much. Mara heard it. So did everyone else. Iris stood but did not crowd her. "Mara, I'm Iris Caldwell. I work with Adult Protective Services." Mara's eyes flashed toward Brendan. "You called them." "I went to the sheriff," Brendan said. "That's different. My dad said you'd do this." The room seemed to draw in around the name. "What did your dad say I'd do?" Mara's mouth tightened. She looked suddenly younger, one hand gripping the edge of her hoodie sleeve. "He said if I told anyone, Grandma and Grandpa would be taken away. He said you'd come in with cops and arrest him in front of them. He said I'd be the reason the family broke." Brendan felt anger rise, but it had nowhere clean to go. Mara looked at the sled. "I didn't want to believe him. But then Grandma kept asking for less food. Grandpa's pills kept running out. The cabin got colder, and Dad kept saying 1 more week." She pulled a small blue notebook from the inside of her jacket. Its corners were bent. A rubber band held it shut. "I wrote things down," she said, "not because I wanted to hurt him," her voice cracked, "because he kept changing what had happened." Brendan did not reach for it. That mattered. Mara looked at him, expecting command, anger, judgment, something adult and heavy. He gave her none of it. "You don't have to choose between loving your father and telling the truth," he said. The sentence broke something in her. She covered her mouth with one hand. Tears spilled over before she could stop them. Voss moved first. He crossed the small room and leaned his shoulder gently against Mara's leg. Not jumping, not demanding attention. Just enough weight to remind her that she did not have to hold herself upright alone. Mara lowered one shaking hand onto his head. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Brendan looked at his niece, the sled, the notebook, the wet knees of her jeans, the medicine she had carried through snow, because every adult in the family had found a reason to be afraid. "No," he said, and his voice was rougher than he meant it to be. "You're the one who kept showing up." Mara cried harder then, silently, with one hand buried in Voss's fur. Iris waited until the girl could breathe again before asking, "May I see the notebook?" Mara nodded and handed it over. Iris opened it carefully. Dates filled the pages, grocery lists, pharmacy reminders, notes about firewood, then shorter entries in darker ink. Dad said Friday, Dad said timber people, Dad said signatures or everything falls apart. Brendan read the line over Iris's shoulder. Friday. The word sat quietly on the page. It was not proof of everything, not yet, but it was the first time the future had appeared in ink, close enough to touch. Arthur saw Brendan's face and closed his eyes. Marion reached for the back of a chair. Mara whispered, "I didn't know what to do." Brendan looked at her, then at his parents, then at the dog standing between 3 generations of the same wounded family. "You're doing it now," he said. Outside, the winter sun began sliding behind the trees, and the cabin filled with the blue light that comes before cold. Patricia Vane Ellis did not arrive like someone bringing comfort. She arrived like someone bringing edges. Her car was a dark sedan with county salt along the lower panels and a cracked leather satchel on the passenger seat. When she stepped onto the cabin porch, she paused long enough to look at the roofline, the stacked damp wood, the narrow path pressed through snow, and the old towel stuffed beneath the door. Not judgment, measurement. Brendan noticed that immediately. Patricia was in her early 60s, tall and spare, with silver hair cut in a blunt bob just below her jaw. She wore a charcoal wool coat over a navy suit and carried herself with the stillness of someone who had learned that frightened families did not need noise. They needed accuracy. Her gray eyes moved from Brendan to Iris, then to Sheriff Calvin Briggs, who stood beside his county truck with his hat in his hands. "Before anyone asks," Patricia said, "no one gets a house back because the story is heartbreaking." Marion stood just inside the doorway, wrapped in her faded cardigan. "Then why are you here?" Patricia looked at her. "Because sometimes a heartbreaking story leaves paperwork behind." That was how she entered the cabin. It's no soft promises, no false certainty. Arthur sat near the stove, the chipped enamel cup on the table, but not in his hands. Since the day before, he had touched it less. Brendan had noticed without commenting. It seemed like a small thing, a cup sitting unused, but small things were the only proof they had that shame could loosen its grip. Voss took his place near the door. He watched Patricia with careful interest, then rested his head on his paws as if deciding she was not a threat, merely a weather system. Patricia removed documents from her satchel, one stack at a time, copies from county records, notes from Iris's assessment, Brendan's transfer confirmations printed from his own bank app, photographs Calvin had taken of the cabin's exterior with Marion and Arthur's permission. Mara's blue notebook rested in the middle of the table, still held shut by its rubber band. "Let's be clear," Patricia said. "Emotion tells us where to look. It does not prove what happened." Brendan stood against the wall, arms folded. "What does? Sequence." Patricia tapped the first page. Timing, capacity, benefit, pressure, money trail. Whether a person understood what they signed, whether the person asking stood to gain. Arthur's jaw tightened. Patricia noticed, but did not soften the words. "Mr. Ashford, this is not about making you feel foolish. It is about showing whether someone used your trust, your illness, or your fatigue to obtain consent that was not fully free." Arthur looked at the table. "That sounds like being foolish with more expensive words." "No," Patricia said. "Foolish is buying a bad lawnmower. This is different." The sentence was so dry that Calvin almost smiled. For the first time all morning, Marion sat without being asked. They worked through the papers slowly. A power of attorney signed 5 weeks after Arthur's heart surgery. A refinancing application 3 months later. A line of credit secured against the house. A management agreement Brendan had never seen. Then the name North Basin Holdings appeared again, nested among mailing addresses, manager signatures, and language designed to make ownership feel less like ownership. Patricia's finger stopped on one paragraph. This gave someone authority to negotiate timber use options on remaining family acreage. Marion looked up. "Timber?" Arthur closed his eyes. Brendan turned toward his father. "Dad." Arthur's voice came low. Trevor said it was nothing. Trees on the backside. Said the house was already tangled up, but the land could help keep the worst from happening. What worst? Arthur did not answer. Mara did. She had been sitting on the cot, knees close together, hands clenched around the cuffs of her navy hoodie. Since Patricia arrived, she had been quiet, watching the adults do what adults had failed to do for too long. "My dad's debt," she said. Everyone turned. Mara reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded sheet of paper inside a plastic sleeve. Her fingers shook so hard she had to try twice to open it. "I didn't steal it," she said quickly. I did, but I took a picture first. Then I got scared he'd throw it away, so I kept the original." She placed it on the table. It was a land map. Not a pretty one, no mountains drawn for tourists, just parcels, lines, access roads, timber sections shaded in pale green, and a red boundary around the Ashford acreage behind the old house. Near the back ridge, someone had circled an area in thick red marker. Beside it, written in block letters, were the words, "Upfront payment clears largest note." No one moved. The stove clicked softly. Brendan stared at the words until they stopped being words and became a shape. His parents' last safety turned into someone else's rope. Patricia adjusted her glasses. "Where did you find this?" "In Dad's truck," Mara said, "under an invoice folder. He thought I was getting jumper cables." "When?" "2 nights ago." Calvin stepped closer to the table but did not touch the map. "Is there a signing date?" Mara nodded. "Friday morning. He said if the signatures didn't happen, everything would fall apart." Marion's face had gone pale. "Friday is tomorrow." The room changed then. Until that moment, the past had been the enemy. Old signatures, old transfers, old excuses. Now the future had arrived with a deadline. Brendan felt the officer in him come awake hard and clean. A timeline, a pending event, a risk that could still be stopped. His body wanted movement, command, doors opening fast. Patricia looked at him before he spoke. "Do not outrun the law because you finally have a direction," she said. He hated that she could read him so easily. "I'm not planning to." "Good, planning is exactly what we need." But Brendan was no longer looking only at the map. He was looking at Mara. The girl had not saved the paper like a witness. She had saved it like a daughter, trying not to betray her father, until betrayal became the only way left to love anyone. He crouched beside the cot so he would not tower over her. "Mara," he said, "you did the right thing." She looked at him with wet eyes. "Then why does it feel like I set a match to my own house?" Before Brendan could answer, the cabin door opened. Cold air rushed in. Trevor Ashford stood on the porch. For 1 second, nobody moved. Even Voss stayed low, only his ears rising. Trevor looked larger in the doorway than Brendan remembered, though not stronger. He was 44, broad through the shoulders but thickened by stress, his brown work jacket stained at the cuffs and damp with melted snow. Dark hair, threaded hard with silver at the temples, had been shoved back by impatient hands. His beard was uneven, as if shaving had become another task he had started and failed to finish. Beneath his eyes sat the blue-gray bruising of a man who had not slept enough to dream. His gaze found Mara first. Then the map, then Brendan. "What is this?" Trevor asked. No one answered quickly enough. His eyes moved to Patricia's satchel, Iris's red folder, Calvin near the stove. "You brought the whole town?" Calvin put his hat down on the table. "Careful." Trevor gave a short laugh. "Of course. The hero comes home and everybody lines up." Brendan straightened. "Don't do that." "Do what? Make this about me so nobody has to look at them." He nodded toward Arthur and Marion. Trevor's face tightened. For the first time, his eyes actually landed on the cabin, not skimmed, not refused, landed. The low fire, the cans, the old blankets, his mother's thin hands. His father's body folded into a chair that was never meant to hold the life he used to have. Something flickered across Trevor's face. Then pride killed it. "You don't get to walk in after years gone and judge what happened here." "I'm not judging what happened," Brendan said. "I'm asking why they're living like this." Trevor stepped inside. Snow fell from his boots onto the swept floor. Marion flinched at the mess, then seemed ashamed of flinching. "You know where I was when Dad came home from surgery?" Trevor asked. His voice rose, but the anger in it had fatigue underneath. I was here. I was the one changing bandages. I was the one driving Mom to the pharmacy. I was the one fixing that back step before she broke a hip. I answered the calls when the furnace quit, when the insurance company wanted forms, when Dad couldn't remember if he'd paid a bill twice or not at all. Brendan said nothing. Because some of it was true. That truth gave Trevor enough room to continue. You sent money and went back to work, Trevor said. Must have felt clean, must have felt noble. Click a button, call it love, go save strangers. Marion whispered. Trevor. No, Mom. He should hear it. Brendan felt every word strike where it had a right to strike. Patricia watched him carefully, as if measuring whether he would become a liability. He did not. You stayed, Brendan said. I didn't. That's true. Trevor blinked, wrong-footed by the admission. Brendan took one step closer. But staying does not give you the right to take from them until there's nothing left. Trevor's mouth opened. No defense came out. Arthur's voice entered the space between them. Son. Trevor turned toward him, and for a second he looked younger. Not innocent. Younger. Arthur's hands trembled on the table. Did you intend to give it back? Trevor's face broke before the answer did. Yes, the word came out small. I did. He looked at Brendan now, pleading and angry at the same time. The first time, I was going to replace it in 2 weeks. The second time, I needed the equipment payment covered, or the crew was gone. Then the loan penalties hit, and one vendor sued, and every time I got close, something else came due. Marion had one hand over her mouth. Trevor pointed at the map. The timber option would clear the biggest note. Not all of it, enough to breathe. With their land, Brendan said. Trevor flinched. With land nobody uses. Arthur's chair scraped back. The sound was not loud, but it ended the argument more sharply than shouting. Nobody uses? Arthur said. Trevor's eyes filled before he could stop them. Arthur stood only halfway, one hand braced on the table, his breath tight with the effort. That land held your mother's garden before the deer took it. That land held the shed where you broke your wrist jumping off the roof after Brendan dared you. That land held every Christmas tree I cut too crooked, 'cause both my boys said it was perfect. Trevor looked at the floor. Arthur sank back into the chair. You can sell a tree. Don't tell me nobody used the ground it grew from. Silence came down hard. Voss rose then. He moved toward Trevor without hurry. Trevor stiffened, but the dog showed no teeth, made no sound. Voss sniffed the snowmelt on Trevor's boots, the cuffs of his jacket, the hand hanging at his side. Then he stopped at Trevor's coat pocket, his nose pressed once lightly against the fabric. Trevor's hand closed over the pocket too fast. Arthur saw it. His face changed. What's in there? Nothing. Arthur's voice sharpened with an old authority Brendan had not heard in years. Trevor. Slowly, Trevor reached into the inside pocket of his work jacket. He pulled out a brass key tied with a short piece of red string. Marion made a sound like the air had been pulled from her. Brendan knew the key before anyone named it. The long brass stem, the worn teeth, the red string Marion had tied there years ago because Arthur kept mixing it up with the shed key. The front door, Arthur said. Trevor stared at it in his palm. The entire cabin seemed to gather around that small piece of metal. The house had been emptied, the photographs taken down, the furniture removed. The parents pushed into woods and cold and explanations, yet Trevor had carried the key. Not as proof of ownership. As punishment, maybe. Or promise. I thought I could fix it, Trevor whispered. No one comforted him. That was mercy of a harder kind. I thought if I kept the key, it meant I hadn't really lost it. His voice frayed. I told myself I'd get the money back. Clear the loans, undo the transfers, move you home before Brendan ever knew. I just needed one more deal. Mara covered her face. Trevor looked at her then, and whatever remained of his defense collapsed. You weren't supposed to carry this, he said. Mara cried without sound. Then why did you keep handing it to me? The question ended him. Trevor sat down on the edge of the cot, as if his legs could no longer hold the person he had been pretending to be. The key lay open in his palm. Patricia let the silence remain long enough for truth to settle, then closed her satchel with a firm click. We have a signing tomorrow morning, she said. A map showing intended timber rights. An older adult with recent surgery and possible compromised understanding at the time of prior documents. A family member under financial distress who stood to benefit. An unsafe living situation, and now a direct admission that funds were taken with intent to repay. Trevor looked up sharply. I didn't say stolen. No, Patricia said. You said enough. Calvin picked up his hat. Iris gathered her folder. Brendan looked from his brother to his parents to Mara and understood that nobody in the room had escaped unharmed. Patricia turned to Brendan. We move now, she said. Not in anger, not for revenge. We move because by tomorrow afternoon this becomes much harder to stop. Outside, the sun had dropped behind the pines. The snow reflected what little light remained, cold and blue. Trevor still held the key. But for the first time, everyone in the cabin could see that it no longer opened what he thought it did. Friday morning arrived with a sky the color of unpolished steel. The county records building stood at the edge of Pine Hollow's courthouse square, its brick walls dark with old weather, its front steps cut clean through fresh snow. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed above a hallway that smelled of wet wool, floor wax, and paper warmed too long by copy machines. Brendan walked in beside his parents, not ahead of them. That mattered. Every instinct in him wanted to lead, clear the room, check corners, put his body between Arthur and every document waiting beyond the next door. But Iris had spoken to him before they left the cabin. Today, your parents need to feel protected, she had said. Not carried. So Brendan slowed his stride. Arthur moved with one hand on a cane Sheriff Calvin Briggs had found in the back of his truck. The old man wore his brown wool coat and a gray knit cap pulled low, but his face looked naked without the cabin's shadows to hide in. Marian held his elbow lightly, her cream cardigan visible beneath a faded blue coat. She had pinned a small silver sparrow brooch near her collar, a detail Brendan had not seen in years. He remembered buying it for her at a school craft fair when he was 11. He had forgotten it existed. She had not. Voss walked close to Arthur's left side, harness on but leash loose in Brendan's hand. The German shepherd's black and tan body moved with quiet discipline, his ears forward, his amber eyes reading every doorway, every footstep, every breath too quick to be ordinary. Calvin entered behind them in uniform. He did not crowd Brendan. He simply stayed close enough to remind everyone in the building that this was not a private family quarrel anymore. Iris carried her red folder. Patricia Vane Ellis carried the rest. The notary office was small and too bright. A rectangular table stood in the center with a stack of documents already arranged in perfect order. A pen lay on top, black, heavy, and polished, as if the room believed the only thing left was a signature. Behind the table sat Marcia Lyle, the county notary. She was a thin woman in her late 50s with gray blonde hair pinned into a bun and the weary composure of someone who had watched too many families pretend that paperwork did not bleed. Her glasses hung low on her nose. When she saw Arthur's shaking hand in Marian's pale face, her own expression tightened by a fraction. Standing beside the window was Graham Whitaker. Brendan knew him before anyone introduced him, not by face, but by contrast. Graham was a tall man in his late 40s, narrow through the shoulders, with sandy blonde hair combed back so neatly it seemed untouched by the weather outside. His charcoal overcoat looked expensive. His leather portfolio was black, clean, and flat. He wore no visible anger, no cruelty on his face, only efficiency. That made Brendan dislike him immediately. Mr. and Mrs. Ashford, Graham said, stepping forward with a professional smile. I appreciate everyone making the effort to come in despite the weather. Marian said nothing. Arthur looked at the table. Trevor stood near the far wall. He looked as though sleep had passed over him and chosen another house. His brown work jacket was cleaner than the day before, but the collar sat crooked. One side of his jaw had been shaved closer than the other. His eyes were bloodshot, and when he saw Mara enter quietly behind Iris, shame moved across his face so quickly Brendan almost missed it. Almost. Mara did not go to him. She sat near the door with both hands locked around the strap of her backpack. Graham opened his portfolio. The timber use option has been discussed previously. Northstar has acted in good faith, and the terms provide an immediate payment that may benefit the family substantially. Patricia placed her satchel on the table. Then good faith will survive a delay. Graham's smile cooled. And you are? Patricia Vane Ellis. Counsel advising Arthur and Marion Ashford pending review of possible undue influence, impaired capacity at the time of earlier documents, and financial exploitation. The notary's pen stopped moving. Trevor closed his eyes. Graham glanced at Calvin, then at Iris. This appears to have become more crowded than a standard signing. Calvin removed his hat. Standard signings don't usually require a sheriff to make sure no one is leaning too hard on old people. Sheriff, Patricia said softly. Calvin gave a small nod and stepped back. Brendan remained silent, but his pulse had begun to beat in his throat. Graham slid the document stack a few inches toward Arthur. Perhaps we should allow Mr. Ashford to speak for himself. It was reasonable. That was the danger. The worst pressure in the room wore reasonable clothes. Marcia Lyle adjusted her glasses. Mr. Ashford, before anything is signed, I need to confirm you understand the general nature of these documents and that you are signing voluntarily. Arthur stared at the papers. His right hand trembled on the cane handle. Trevor took one step forward. Dad, it's what we talked about. It gives us room. That's all. Just room. Marion turned toward him. Trevor, don't. I'm not forcing him. Trevor's voice cracked. I'm asking him. No, Patricia said. You are asking him with your ruin placed on the table beside the pen. That is not neutral. Trevor flushed. You don't know anything about us. I know enough to ask for review. Graham exhaled politely. Counsel, with respect. This agreement does not transfer ownership. It concerns timber rights for a defined term and compensation agreed upon in advance. And if the parties did not understand the practical consequences, they had opportunities to review. Arthur suddenly looked up. The room quieted. His mouth opened, but no words came. His eyes moved from Graham to Patricia, from Patricia to Trevor, from Trevor to the pen. Brendan watched the familiar misery enter his father's face, the old reflex to end the conflict by giving someone what they wanted. Brendan felt himself step forward before he decided to. Calvin's hand landed on his shoulder. Not hard, not restraining like an arrest, just enough weight to bring him back into his own body. Stand still, Calvin murmured. Brendan's jaw clenched. At the table, Graham placed the pen closer to Arthur. That was when Voss moved. The dog did not bark. He did not pull against the leash. He simply walked forward until his head was beside Arthur's knee, then lowered himself and rested his chin on the old man's boot. Arthur looked down. His trembling hand left the cane and settled on Voss's head. The German shepherd stayed perfectly still beneath the touch. Something changed in Arthur's breathing. Not courage, exactly. Courage sounded too bright for what happened. It was more like a man finding one solid board beneath his foot after years of standing on ice. Marcia Lyle leaned forward. Mr. Ashford, Arthur swallowed. I don't know enough, he said. Trevor's face collapsed. Arthur kept his hand on Voss. I thought I did. I thought if I signed, the room would get quiet. But I don't know enough. Marcia reached for the pen and drew it back to her side of the table. Then I cannot notarize today. Graham's politeness cracked for the first time. This is highly irregular. No, Marcia said, her voice tired but firm. This is precisely what my commission requires me to do. Patricia's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. The emergency petition has been accepted for a same-day hearing, she said. 2 o'clock. Graham closed his portfolio with a soft snap. Northstar will respond accordingly. Trevor looked at his father. Dad, please. Arthur's hand trembled again, but it remained on Voss. No, he said. This time the word held. The courtroom that afternoon was smaller than Brendan expected. No jury, no crowd, no dramatic echo. Just worn carpet, polished benches, the county seal on the wall, and snowlight pressing through tall windows behind the judge's chair. The plainness of the room made everything heavier. There was nowhere for performance to hide. Judge Evelyn Harrow entered with a slim file in one hand. She was a black woman in her early 60s with close-cropped silver hair and a calm, unsentimental face. Her robe looked less like a symbol of power than a tool she had learned to use carefully. When she sat, the room settled around her. This is an emergency petition regarding proposed timber rights and concerns involving undue influence and potential financial exploitation of elderly adults, she said. I understand time is an issue. That does not mean clarity will be sacrificed. Patricia stood. She did not tell the story the way Brendan felt it. She did not talk about the glove, the empty house, the hunger in his mother's shoulders, or the way Arthur held a chipped cup because shame needed something to grip. She built the case in dates. Arthur's heart surgery, the power of attorney signed 5 weeks afterward, refinancing, the line of credit, the management structure tied to North Basin Holdings, Brendan's regular transfers intended for parental care, the unsafe living conditions documented by Iris, Mara's notes about Friday, timber people, signatures, the pending agreement that would affect the last remaining valuable family acreage. Each fact landed without music. That made them harder to dismiss. Graham argued smoothly that North Star Timber had no role in family disputes and had proceeded based on documents presented as valid. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His argument was built from clean paper and distance. Trevor sat with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. He did not look at Mara. That seemed to hurt her more than if he had glared. Judge Harrow asked Arthur several questions herself. Do you understand what timber rights are? Arthur hesitated. Better now than yesterday. That is not quite an answer. No, Mom. Did you feel pressure to sign? Arthur looked at Trevor. Everyone in the room seemed to stop breathing. Yes, Arthur said quietly, but some of it came from me. I wanted to save my son from what he'd done. I wanted to believe one more signature could make him my boy again. Trevor covered his face. Judge Harrow's expression did not change, but her voice softened by a shade. Mr. Ashford, love can be real, and pressure can still exist. Arthur bowed his head. Iris testified next, brief and careful. She described the cabin's condition, the limited medication, the inadequate heat, the food supply, and the risk presented by isolation in winter. She did not shame Marion or Arthur. She called the conditions unsafe, not the people. Calvin confirmed the welfare concern and the potential intimidation signaled by the late-night vehicle without claiming more than he knew. Naomi Fletcher, called only for general context, explained how family financial exploitation often begins with trusted access and grows through repeated small exceptions. She did not mention private account details. Patricia made sure of that. Mara was asked only 3 questions. Had she brought food and medicine to her grandparents? Yes. Had she heard her father refer to a Friday signing involving timber people? Yes. Had she felt afraid that telling someone would break her family? Mara's voice nearly disappeared. Yes. Brendan stared at the floor until the words stopped cutting. At last, Judge Harrow leaned back. I am not deciding ownership today, she said. I am not making a final finding of criminal conduct today. The court is deciding whether there is credible concern requiring temporary protection before the proposed transaction proceeds. Graham stood straighter. Trevor looked as if he had already heard the answer. The court finds credible concern regarding undue influence, possible impaired understanding at the time of prior documents, and risk of financial exploitation. The proposed timber agreement and any related transfer, option, or encumbrance involving the Ashford acreage are temporarily enjoined pending further review. Marion made a small sound beside Brendan, not triumph. Air returning. The court orders an independent capacity evaluation for Mr. Ashford, financial review of relevant transactions under proper authority, and temporary protective oversight coordinated with Adult Protective Services. No family member currently under review is to obtain new signatures, authorizations, or property-related consent from Mr. or Mrs. Ashford without counsel present. The gavel did not strike dramatically. Judge Harrow simply signed the order. It was enough. Outside the courtroom, the hallway was too bright and too narrow for what everyone carried out of it. Graham Whitaker left first, speaking into his phone before the door had fully closed behind him. Calvin remained near the wall, giving Brendan space but not leaving him alone. Iris spoke quietly with Marion about temporary arrangements and medication refills. Trevor stood by the courthouse window. Mara watched him from 10 feet away. He finally looked at her. Whatever he saw in his daughter's face made him turn back toward the glass. Brendan wanted to feel victory. He wanted the clean burn of justice, the satisfaction of a danger stopped, but there was none. The land had been paused, not saved. The house had been questioned, not restored. His parents were protected for the moment, not healed. Voss stood beside Arthur, his harness dark against the polished floor. Arthur's hand rested lightly on the dog's head. Brendan looked at them and understood the day for what it was. Not an ending. A hand catching the edge of a cliff, and beneath that hand the fall was still there. Winter did not end all at once in Pine Hollow. It loosened slowly. Snowbanks shrank by the inch. Rooflines began to drip in the afternoons and freeze again by dusk. Tire tracks widened on side roads. The pines behind the old Ashford place held their white burden longer than the fields, as if the woods did not trust spring enough to let go. Neither did the family. The emergency order had stopped the timber agreement, but it had not restored what had been taken. Nothing about the months that followed was clean enough to be called justice, in the way Brendan once understood the word. There were interviews, account reviews, property filings examined under proper authority, capacity evaluations, calls from attorneys, appointments with adult protective services, forms Arthur hated. Questions Marion answered, with her hands folded so tightly in her lap that Brendan sometimes wanted to interrupt and tell everyone she had suffered enough. He did not. He was learning the difference between protecting someone and making decisions over them, because protection made him feel useful. Trevor cooperated after the hearing. Not nobly at first, not gracefully. There were days when he answered questions because his lawyer told him silence would make things worse. Days when shame turned him sharp. Days when he looked at Brendan with a resentment that said, "You got to arrive after the damage and be called the good son." Brendan did not defend himself from that look. There was enough truth in it to let it stand, but cooperation became steadier as the weeks passed. Trevor admitted to using money meant for Arthur and Marion's care, first with the intention to repay it, then with the desperate arithmetic of a man who had started moving debt from one corner of his life to another until every corner gave way. The money had not bought a second house, a boat, or vacations. It had vanished into failed equipment leases, late payroll, vendor lawsuits, penalties, interest, and all the expensive ways pride tries to delay surrender. That did not make it harmless. Patricia Vane Ellis made sure no one in the room confused sadness with innocence. Trevor lost all authority over his parents' finances. He signed a repayment agreement he would spend years fulfilling. He sold what remained of his business equipment, a rusted trailer, a hydraulic lift, 2 trucks, a set of tools Arthur had once helped him choose. He gave up any claim or control connected to the Ashford property and agreed to ongoing legal oversight. The criminal inquiry remained open long enough to remind him that remorse was not a receipt. There was no dramatic arrest on Main Street, no shouting crowd, no easy satisfaction. Some people in town thought that was too merciful. Others, who had sons with debts or brothers with failed businesses or parents who had signed things they should not have signed, said less. Pine Hollow had always been good at judging from porches. It was less comfortable when a family's ruin sounded close to prayers it had whispered over its own kitchen tables. Arthur and Marion stayed temporarily in a small assisted apartment near the clinic while Brendan decided what to do with the old house. At first, he wanted to fix everything. That was his instinct. Identify damage, repair structure, replace what was missing, bring his parents home. He walked through the old Ashford house with a contractor and a legal pad, writing down every cost. Furnace, roof, water damage under the kitchen sink, porch railing, new locks, fresh paint for the rectangles where photographs had been removed. He imagined Marion back in her kitchen, Arthur in the living room, Voss sleeping by the front door. He imagined returning the house to them would erase the cabin. Marion was the one who stopped him. They stood in the empty kitchen one afternoon, while the contractor measured cabinet height. Sunlight came through the window and touched the spot on the sill where her violet pot had once stood. She wore a pale blue sweater under her coat and the silver sparrow brooch near her collar. Her hair was pinned neatly, but the wind had loosened a few strands at her temples. "Brendan," she said. He looked up from the legal pad. "We can lower these shelves, put in railings, better heat. The front steps need work, but no." The word was gentle, final. He lowered the pen. Marion looked around the kitchen without reaching for anything. "You are trying to give us back the room where you last felt like a son." He had no answer. "I don't need a big house to prove you love me," she said. "I need a place where your father can reach the bathroom without stairs. I need a window with morning light. I need to sleep without listening for tires on a logging road." The contractor pretended very hard to study his tape measure. Brendan folded the legal pad closed. For a moment, he felt the boy in him protest. This was their house. The pencil marks on the pantry door, the porch swing, the Christmas mornings. The place love was supposed to return to when it had lost its way. But then he saw what Marion saw, not home, a witness. Some places could be repaired and still remain too full of what happened inside them. "All right," he said. She touched his sleeve. "Build small." So he did. The new house stood 3 blocks from the clinic, close enough to Main Street for neighbors to pass by without making a project of kindness. It was modest, 1 story, painted soft gray with white trim and a porch facing east. Brendan chose wide doorways, no stairs, a kitchen with lower cabinets, heated flooring near the entry, and a bedroom where Arthur could see the pines through the window without being hidden among them. Marion chose the curtains. Arthur complained about the curtains. Then he sat beneath them every morning with coffee and said nothing when sunlight warmed his knees. Voss claimed the rug by the front door on the second day. From there, he could see the porch, the kitchen, the hallway, and the street beyond the window. His harness hung on a hook now more often than he wore it. In the new house, he usually wore only his black collar and the small silver tag that caught the light when he lifted his head. Boss of the Threshold, Arthur called him. Voss ignored the title with professional dignity. Mara came every Saturday, not through the woods, not with a sled, not looking over her shoulder. She drove an old blue hatchback Brendan helped her find and parked it boldly in the driveway, as if visibility itself had become part of her healing. Her backpack still came with her, but it no longer sagged with canned food and medicine. Now it carried textbooks, a half-finished scarf Marion was teaching her to knit, and sometimes the small blue notebook. She had not thrown it away. She had also stopped letting it be the only place truth lived. Mara began speaking to Trevor again before Brendan did. Not easily, not warmly at first. Their conversations took place in public places, the diner, the church basement after counseling meetings, a picnic table outside the library when the weather softened. She set rules, no asking her to carry messages, no asking whether Grandma and Grandpa were over it, no blaming Brendan for what documents had already proven. Trevor listened badly at first, then a little better. By late spring, he was attending financial counseling in Missoula and a support group for failed small business owners held in the basement of a community center. He hated both. That was how Mara knew he was probably telling the truth about going. Brendan saw him only twice in those months. The first time was across the courthouse hallway where Trevor looked away. The second time was at the edge of the new house's driveway in early May, holding a bundle of split dry wood tied with twine. The snow had retreated to shaded ditches by then, but cold still came down from the mountains after sunset. Trevor stood beside his truck as if he had not decided whether he had a right to step closer. His brown work jacket was clean, his beard was trimmed, the heavy ring of keys that used to hang at his belt was gone. In his hands, the wood looked less like a gift than a sentence he had chosen to serve one bundle at a time. Brendan opened the door before he knocked. For several seconds, the brothers only looked at each other. Then Voss appeared beside Brendan. The German shepherd sniffed once toward Trevor, then stepped back from the doorway. Not welcome. Not warning. Room. Trevor's eyes moved to the dog, and the smallness of that mercy seemed to hurt him. I brought this, he said. Brendan did not move to take it. For them? Trevor nodded. Then ask them. Inside, Marion had gone very still. Arthur sat in his chair by the window, one hand folded over the other. Mara, who had been setting the table, stood with a plate in midair. No one rushed. No one saved Trevor from the silence. At last, Marion came to the door. Trevor held out the wood. I know it doesn't fix anything, he said. No, Marion answered. It doesn't. His face tightened, but he nodded. Arthur looked at him for a long time. His voice, when it came, was rough but not cruel. Stack it by the side porch. Bark down. It keeps better. Trevor closed his eyes briefly. All right. That was all. He carried the wood around the house and stacked it exactly as Arthur had said. No embrace followed. No forgiveness was declared over the smell of cut pine. But when Trevor left, Marion did not lock the door immediately. She stood with her hand on the knob and watched his truck turn carefully onto the street. Some openings were not wide enough to walk through yet. They were still openings. Brendan changed in quieter ways. He called more. Not because guilt was useful, but because absence had become too expensive to keep paying. He began stopping by without needing a crisis. He learned the rhythm of his parents' ordinary days, Arthur's morning stiffness, Marion's habit of overwatering the new kitchen plant, the visiting nurse's schedule, which neighbor brought soup because she wanted praise, and which brought soup because she remembered being hungry once. He also stopped calling money help, when money was only money. One evening he sat on the porch with Arthur while Voss slept between them. The sky was bright with lingering cold, and the pines beyond town stood black against a violet dusk. Arthur said, You still angry? Yes, at me? Brendan thought about lying. No, sometimes. Not the way you mean. Arthur nodded as if that was fair. I should've told you. I should've asked better questions. The old man glanced at him. That's supposed to make us even? No. Good. Arthur looked back toward the street. Even would be too easy. They sat without talking after that, and for once the silence did not feel like a wall. By the time the first snow returned months later, the new house no longer smelled new. It smelled of wood stove smoke, Marion's lavender soap, coffee. Arthur made too strong now because he had begun pretending weakness was something that happened to other men, and the faint dog smell Voss carried in from the porch. On the morning the snow came, Marion unpacked the last small box from storage. Brendan watched from the entryway as she removed a framed photograph wrapped in newspaper. It showed the family years ago. Arthur brought her, Marion laughing, Brendan in a police academy sweatshirt, Trevor younger and unburdened, both brothers standing too far apart without yet knowing how far apart life could make them. Marion stood before the living room wall for a long while. Then she hung it. Not centered perfectly. Not high enough, according to Arthur. Too high, according to Mara when she arrived later. Marion ignored them both. Voss lay on the rug near the door, silver tag resting against his collar. Arthur sat by the window with one hand on the dog's head, fingers moving slowly through the thick fur. Outside, snow fell bright and clean over the porch rail, the street, the small yard, and the path Trevor had shoveled the week before without coming inside. Brendan stepped out onto the porch for air. On the small table beside the door sat a wooden box Arthur had made years ago for spare screws. Inside it lay the brass key to the old house, the red string still tied through its head, not hidden, not worshipped, just kept. A thing that opened a door they no longer needed to live behind. Brendan looked through the window at his parents, at Mara laughing at something Marion had said, at Voss guarding the threshold without being asked. He had spent years believing protection meant arriving in time to stop danger. Now he knew better. Sometimes protection meant returning after the damage and not pretending it had not happened. Sometimes it meant standing still while the law did its work. Sometimes it meant letting a door open only an inch and not forcing it wider because forgiveness made a better ending. Snow gathered on his shoulders. Behind him, Inside the small gray house, voices rose and settled, imperfect and alive. Brendan opened the door and went back in. In the end, this story reminds us that love is not proven by how much we give from a distance, but by whether we show up when the truth becomes uncomfortable. A house can be repaired, money can be repaid, but trust only begins to heal when someone finally stops hiding, stops excusing harm, and chooses what is right over what is easy. Maybe there is someone in your life who needs more than a quick message or a silent prayer. Maybe they need your presence, your honesty, or your courage to ask one more question. May God give us the wisdom to protect the vulnerable, the humility to admit where we failed, and the grace to come home before silence does more damage. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from, and please like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this.